Okay, all right, we'll kick it off. So this is about an hour. We might have some time for some Q&A. We'll go through, at a high level, how we took Tomb Raider, started it, looked at reinventing it, and all the way through the last 4 years to what we have released March the 5th, just recently. My name is Darrell Gallagher. I'm the studio head for Crystal Dynamics, and to my right here is Noah Hughes, creative director at Crystal Dynamics and on Tomb Raider. So we're just off the back of a very successful launch of Tomb Raider. How many here have actually played it or seen it? Some hands? Good. Awesome. Nice. Nice. That's a good start. All right.
Thank you.
How many here have got a hangover from last night? That's why so excuse any stumbles. Okay, so thankfully we had a great launch in March for this game, and we had this talk prepped prior to launching the game on the reinvention and reboot of Tomb Raider. And it was successful, so we didn't have to rewrite the talk, which we're very happy about. It could have been a what went wrong. Thankfully, it's not that. So it really is a broad case of here are some things that we thought went well, some pro tips around the project, and some experiences we had from start to finish that we hope that we can share with you today. So we're going to go through a quick outline here. From a franchise perspective, how we went about reinventing an icon such as Lara Croft and Tomb Raider, goals and methodology, in terms of our high-level goals at the beginning of the project, some of the things we want to achieve, some production techniques in terms of how we made the project and how we went through each phase of the project at a high level, creative techniques with Noah in terms of how we went about making a very narrative-driven production, and it involved changing major parts of how we did things at Crystal. And last but not least, some pro tips that we hope we can leave you with today and maybe take back to your studios and learn from. So at a high level, it was roughly a 4-year period from start to finish on this project. And it wasn't always perfect. So while this PowerPoint is nice and slick, and we've rehearsed, and we'll go through it in an hour, the actual production of 4 years, you're going to have bumps along the way. So I just wanted to say that these are some of the good things we've learned. But any project you do that is special, and we wanted this to be special, is going to be tough. And it had bumps along the way, so this is a consolidated version of that. Digging into the project, it's the biggest game that we've ever done at Crystal. It's 2 teams that have worked on this. We did the single player here, close to here, 25 miles away in Redwood City, and the multiplayer was done with our sister studio, Eidos Montreal, in Canada. We were lucky enough to get a huge amount of recognition along the way. As we were making this game, we had over 50 magazine covers and 2 E3 stage demos and over 150 awards and nominations along the way, which on a long development of sort of 3 or 4 years is very encouraging and definitely put some fuel in the fire that we were doing something right. It's been the biggest week 1 sales in franchise history. We're only a few weeks into that launch right now, and it's been the biggest opening so far of 2013. So we're happy with the outcome. We're certainly in a place where we feel like we're on our road to achieving everything we wanted to. I'm going to play a quick video right now, which is just a short 60-second sort of recap of where we landed.
Mayday! Does Lara Croft... Every survivor has a story.
Got great instincts, Cal. You just have to trust them.
Every mystery has its truth. What the hell is happening on this island? Every saga has its beginning.
All right, there it is. So we're going to talk about how we got there from beginning, middle to end. It was an epic adventure, much like one of Lara's, and we're going to walk you through that. At a very high level, some of our challenges, it's great to be working on a franchise like Tomb Raider with the recognition and the popularity it has, but it came with challenges, and with 17 years of history since 1996, it left us in a position as we finished up 3 games at Crystal feeling like we had to make some changes. And that's natural when you're dealing with a long-running franchise, but we were really encountering this for the first time. As a result of the ups and downs of that long history, you have sort of mixed feelings and loyalty around sort of a fan base. We had new contenders at that time in 2008, 2009 when we were starting this, in the likes of Assassin's Creed or Uncharted or God of War 3. There was a new generation of hardware, and there were new contenders to the action-adventure crown that were bringing their new angles and really doing some great stuff around action-adventure too. Also, we had a generational change not only in hardware, but it was also in terms of our fan base and our audience as well. Obviously, 17 years later, the people that may have started playing Tomb Raider in '96 may be different people today. They maybe never played it before. Some people will have, and some people won't. So we also had to think about how we spanned from one generation to another, and that was some of the challenges we were dealing with going into this project. So these were some of the things we did coming off the back of a trilogy we created in Legend, Anniversary and Underworld. And as we finished that up, that was very much based on a formula very much from core design, and we were successful with that formula. But going into this new phase of Tomb Raider, these were some of the challenges that we felt like we had to deal with. From a goals perspective, ultimately, we wanted people to fall in love with Tomb Raider once again with this next game, and this is what we started with way back when. We had a real goal to make Lara somebody you could get to know again, to humanize her, for her to be less of this superhero that you knew because you played n number of games and seen the movies, but somebody that we actually got to know once again and fall in love with over again, like it happened in 1996. So therefore, we had to challenge the expectations around Lara and the brand. We had to make sure that we were embracing this new audience that maybe hadn't played Tomb Raider before, or maybe they were old fans that were revisiting that we had lost along the way. And to do that, we really felt like we had to make some big changes. Quality and innovation were synonymous with Tomb Raider in 1996 and along the way. It was one of the pioneers in action-adventure. So we wanted to put that stamp back into this game. We wanted to be right up there as the best of the best. So these were high goals that we had at the beginning of this project. And ultimately, we still had to thread the needle because it's a tightrope to walk between old and new. That we had this franchise with this fan base and all this rich history, but we wanted to take it to a new place. And that tightrope is a very, very narrow one to walk, because too much old and it feels like it's the old game and it may as well be a sequel. Too much new and maybe it wouldn't be Tomb Raider anymore. And whilst we sort of approached this with a blank canvas, the actual reality was it was a very, very narrow razor that we had to walk. So it's tough doing these types of games as reboots. Originally, it actually didn't start as a reboot, it was almost a pseudo-sequel. And as ideas were being kicked around in the early stages of development in concept and in pre-production, it became clear that to achieve the goals that we had just set out in slides before, that we ultimately had to wipe the slate clean. And we needed to make a fresh start with this character and a fresh start with no preconceptions built in for the audience. So ultimately, it became an origin story, and we were buoyed and encouraged by other franchises around us outside video games, where we'd looked and we'd felt that they had actually taken a similar approach. So here we have Bond and Batman, that are two amazing examples outside games, where Bond has been around 50 years this year and has just done $1 billion at the box office. So it's as fresh as it was 50 years ago today, and Batman is in a similar place as well. And I think the key thing about this, and why we looked here, is because in games having 17 years of history, ultimately we were one of the first to have to go through this. It's a shorter time scale in games in terms of people having franchises, because game space is much narrower and obviously younger than things like movies. So we looked outside, and what we felt was these franchises have done such a great job in retaining the DNA of their characters and their franchises, but bringing it to new generations and really making it feel fresh. And they've managed to span generation to generation, but retain their franchise integrity. So we were very much inspired by this and this origin story, but we really had to find our own slant on that. And ultimately, We knew we wanted to make an origin story. We knew that we had these high goals, but we were looking in early stages around how we could hang our hooks on something that made it feel fresh for Tomb Raider and also fresh in the industry. So many ideas were thrown around and explored in the early stages of development, and ultimately we landed in a spot where we found something we felt that we could hang our hooks on, which I'll hand over to Noah to discuss.
Yeah, it was important to understand that in humanizing Lara by rolling her back to an origin story, we were making her closer to you or I, and hopefully a more relatable character. But the most exciting part about it was that we could then take her on that journey. We could take the players on that journey to becoming the Tomb Raider. But we needed a sense of identity beyond just origin story. So we looked at a lot of different things, but ultimately we came upon the idea of survival stories. And for us, we were really inspired by the real-world tales of survival. We have Aaron Ralston here, who featured in 127 Hours, ultimately had to cut off his own arm in order to survive, or the rugby players in the Andes who resorted to cannibalism in order to survive. These are sort of at the surface very dark stories, but what was interesting to us is there was a sense of inspiration to these stories, that there was a memorable journey here that showcased the human capacity to overcome, and ultimately through that journey these people were changed as well. So that idea that we could take Lara's origin story and tell it through the lens of survival was very compelling to us, and we felt would help humanize her as a character. But we had to zoom in a little bit and understand what that meant. I think what we found was that survival can be many different things to many different people. So we tried to clarify what it would mean to us in this game. So first of all, survival action. And that's to sort of balance out this sense that there's a simulation version of survival as well. But because pace was incredibly important to our game experience, we really wanted to capture that survival action. But it would still be brutal, perilous, raw. This would be the harsh environment that would forge Lara. It would ultimately ask her to fight to survive, that we wanted to showcase her determination as a character, her endurance, her will to live in the face of death, but also as a character who's sort of an intellectual hero. We loved that aspect of resourcefulness that we saw in these stories. Here's people who had nothing and they had to make do with what they had, and it was really that ability to adapt to their situation that let them survive. So these were all things that very much resonated with the franchise for us. So just to capture some in a sentence, the idea of the determination to go beyond human endurance, taking the moment of raw instinct and stretching it. It's about overcoming near-death experiences time and time again. So we had now an inspiration in survival, and at the end of this concept phase, we sort of summed that up with "A survivor is born," and ultimately that became our tagline, but internally it was also a guiding vision. It captured that idea of Lara's origin story seen through the lens of survival. So with that, we felt we had a very clear sense of a high-level vision for the game. So we'll turn it over to Darrell to get back into production a little bit.
Thanks, Noah. So now we had our identity, at least a hook that we felt we could work with, and a high level of what we wanted to do with the game. And ultimately, going into the high level in production, I guess I wanted to sort of carve out what we use, which is a rule of thirds. This, at a high level, is what we've done on the last couple of projects at Crystal, including Lara Croft and the Guardian of Light. And essentially it's just breaking your production from a high level into 1/3 for pre-production and what we call vertical slice, which is the end of pre-production for us, 1/3 for production and 1/3 for post-production. Some commentary around that. I mean, typically what we've seen, we've all made lots of games here, is that first third and that last third tend to get squished and shortchanged in lots of ways. And we felt that it was important that we actually maintained sort of an uncompromising view on what we wanted in each third, and therefore shape the production around this rule of thirds. We wanted to give as much time as we could in post-production to polish and refine what we had, and we wanted to make sure that every step of the way in pre-production and vertical slice, it was clear what game we were making. So there's always a lot of pressures in each one of these phases. Even though it was a 4-year period, essentially once we found our hook of survival in early exploration, really that pre-production to vertical slice phase was 1 year, production was 1 year, and post-production was 1 year. And we're going to walk through each one of those phases at a high level and show some videos of where we were at each stage. So some quick stats around it. We made a 12-hour plus experience. 10 to 12 hours is what we were aiming for. We actually found that once people played the game, we saw them play for 14, 18, 20, 25 and more. So we've been very pleased with the feedback. So we absolutely built a very, very big production in this game because it was a complex, big game to make. So we had to focus very much on our tools and pipeline. And I know Jason has given a talk this week around our tools. Also, there's some other talks around our process today as well from some other folks at Crystal, so please go see those. But tools and pipeline, because we weren't going to be an army of hundreds making this game, we were going to be under 100 ultimately making this game happen on the single player side. So we wanted tools and pipelines to really be that driving force to help us iterate quickly, to help designers and artists really have the power in their hands. So there's a big investment in the tools that we made to make a level editor that really put the power in the content creator's hands with live editing, live updating, and a very flexible, powerful system to create content. We totally turned our production methodology on its head, and in many ways in this production we did things very, very differently. And because we were building such an important origin story, we actually made it a beat-driven development process. Now we'll actually go into a little bit more detail there. But essentially, in previous games, it was saying we wanted to do 10 or 12 hours. What's the footprint for that? It's about this big. Let's fill it with stuff. This one, we still wanted 10 to 12 hours, but we wanted every moment to feel like it fitted into a larger picture. So the scheduling and production was built around beats and moments that we wanted to deliver from an experiential standpoint. And that's how we costed things, that's how we produced things, and that's how we scheduled out the whole production. So the actual footprint from the game was built from beats, which we'll go into again a little later with Noah. We also had a very modular level design process, especially on the art side, that ultimately we had to build big worlds, biggest worlds we've ever built for Tomb Raider, and we had to do it in a way where we kept the fidelity, but we kept flexibility in building them too. So we had a very instance-driven art approach with the art team and the design team, where there was a lot of repetition, a lot of kind of clicking together Lego pieces to really build an organic world. And that was a complete 180 on how we built things before at Crystal, where we had and still do have a very crafted look. But ultimately, we wanted that crafted look, but we wanted flexibility with it. So it was really about embracing this modular development process and pipeline as well. And that allowed us to ultimately get to the point where we could bring on partners to work with us. And we had a robust outsourcing pipeline that by the end of production, we were able to actually send out a rough version of a level in Greybox that had been designed with modules over to partners overseas in Shanghai, and we would get back an alpha quality level at the end that required some touch-up and finishing, but ultimately was produced with external partners, which was an amazing feat when we have a very high bar for our game. We had multiple cinematic production companies through production as well. So we worked externally with a number of partners on over 90 minutes of story content for cinematics. So it was a very big production overall. I think one of the key things that we did in the last couple of games, including this one, is this philosophy is know as you go, as I put it. And essentially, we put quality as the premium, which makes it very difficult to schedule. So ultimately, we put the emphasis on knowing every step of the way whether we were actually achieving what we wanted to achieve from a quality perspective. And this allowed us to scope along the way when we were off in time or off in targets, and shape and change our production in order to maintain quality and deliver against our high goals. Ultimately, one of the problems we've seen in the past is if you deliver things at 50% or 60% at alpha and don't take it all the way up, it can be difficult to schedule that post-production part of the project. And quite often we see, and I've seen projects really get to the point where they've actually taken too much time in production, they haven't really understood how long it takes to get to the quality bar they're aiming for, and ultimately there's a block of time, which is your alpha to bug fixing to shipping, and that is relatively immovable at that point because it's very very late in the production process. So what we wanted to do on this was essentially not wait to find out exactly what game we were making, but be sure every step of the way. So it had to be great at every milestone. And that was really our philosophy on the last few games at Crystal, that ultimately, if you're not great every step of the way, then don't expect to be great at the end. So we wanted every milestone to be great, and we wanted to know whether we were on or off. And ultimately, even though we use production schedules to drive our metrics, and we use production to really calibrate what we're doing and how fast we're going, the sticks and the screen really are our ultimate production schedule. And it's about picking up the controller, playing the game, and saying, is it great? And if not, scope accordingly, change, fix it, and do whatever we can to get that right. So we were iterating to make sure that we held up that bar every step of the way. It's important you don't drink your own Kool-Aid, and you're not the one saying it's great, but other people are too. Ultimately, we're making this for an audience. So it was important that we also brought that audience into Crystal, and we got validation along the way that what we thought was great was actually working for them too. So we have a focus testing lab at Crystal. We had focus testing from pre-production all the way through to the end of the production, roughly every 2 weeks early on in pre-production, through production, going down to every week and almost every day as we got through to the end of the project. And that was key in terms of understanding whether our choices from a design standpoint were actually working when people got their hands on the sticks. I think one of the other biggest things we did was build our game as episodic chunks, and this was a very different way of building. We had built our game in contiguous chunks of content that were almost products in themselves within a larger production cycle. So they were developed to an alpha quality before we moved on, and ultimately if we didn't hit what we felt from a quality standpoint within these chunks, they were roughly about 3 hours each. Then we would iterate until we did, and we would scope the remainder of the project to make sure that we still hit our timelines that we needed to. And this allowed if we were productizing along the way and essentially making nuggets of product that were 3-hour chunks, what we could do is really very clearly see where we were on or we were off, and make choices along the way. And as we said, it's game development, so it's never perfect, and you're always making choices. So the more knowledge you have and the more data you have about whether you're on or off from a quality standpoint, if you're putting that as a premium, it allows for better choices down the line. So we made many scoping decisions along the way around the content at the end of each one of these chunks, which we're actually going to show shortly some videos of. We could review it, we could refine at the end of every episode, and we could come back to the next episodic chunk that the whole team was on at any one point and say, how do we do it better next time? And through that process, it really did get faster and quicker to produce the game. So moving into pre-production, again, that sense of it being a product really existed in our first playable. And ultimately, even though we spent quite a long time looking at different flavors of the game and before hanging our hooks on survival, ultimately when we came to doing our first playable demo, we wanted to make that feel like a product in itself. And ultimately that had a beginning, middle, and end. It was a 30-minute experience, and we wanted it to feel like you could put it in somebody's hands and it was as close to a shipping game as we could make. So we started that in 2010. It took about 5 months to develop our first playable demo, and I think a testament to that is out of that first playable, it was taken to, as I said, a 30-minute sort of chunk of shippable game almost. We actually presented that to Game Informer, and we were lucky enough that they put it on the front cover and really embraced what we were doing, because they could see very clearly at that stage what we were making. So it was definitely one of those things internally. It was a great calibration tool for us to work with. In terms of approaching it, Noah's going to take a look at the pillars, and then we'll show some short videos as well around it.
Yeah, so as we step through each of these phases of production, I'm just going to give you a few glimpses of some of the key documents we used to capture the creative intent, and also give some snapshots of actually what we were putting on screen. So we had this idea of the survival-informed origin story, but it was also a Tomb Raider game. So as we start to set out to make the game itself, understanding how that applies to the gameplay experience is important. So we've always had the sense of our core pillars in a Tomb Raider franchise. So traversal, combat, and smart Lara, or puzzle solving, are really our core gameplay mechanics. And as we discussed before, we were going to infuse them with this flavor of survival action. So in the case of traversal, that meant, treacherous, dangerous world, and ultimately less canned controls, less canned jumps, so you really felt at any moment you could fail, and you were in connection with the character. In terms of combat, we moved from a lock-based system to a full third-person aim system, but also really tried to capture that sense of desperation. We were rolling Lara back to a point where she was far less confident and far less competent than people knew her as, and we wanted that to show in her animation and in her mechanics. And in the case of puzzles, we really embraced the idea of physics, both for its simulation aspect, but also the idea that it helped players with an understanding of cause and effect, that by using fire and water and mass and pulleys, we could create environmental challenges that really asked the player to, like we saw in the survival stories, use what was at hand in order to overcome their obstacles. So this is very simple, and you'll see with a lot of these, it is important to be able to boil things down to a very simple view, and sort of guide your vision with very clear and precise concepts. This is a little more complex, but it's really just speaking to a philosophy we had, which was the idea that these gameplay, the spikes of different colors are really our different gameplay flavors, but the dotted line represents this experience. So in a lot of ways, what we were creating was not a sequence of game design challenges, but really an experience made up of those challenges. So that's a philosophy. This idea of variety and intensity as a function of pacing is something you'll see through all of our docs here. We're going to take a quick look at actually some of the content that we were putting on screen at this time. So this was in mid-2010. This was cut from probably about 30 minutes of gameplay, and we cut it together at the time. So this was sort of our trailer packaged up, and this helped us both internally see our concepts in practice, but also, as Darrell mentioned, starting to generate support externally, both within the organization and within the press.
You've seen me before. The Brit princess. Rich girl with a pretty face. Shiny guns. And a flair for gymnastics. I think you've got me mixed up with someone else. I'm not perfect. I'm not bulletproof. I struggle. I bleed. I get lost. Pain. I know fear. One day, I will become a legend, a warrior, a raider. I will be a survivor. Still think you know me?
All right. Pro tip, don't put your date on the end of your first playable trailer and announce it to the public. But ultimately, actually, I think the thing about the date, I mean, we really were aiming for the end of 2012, but the know as you go philosophy really actually showed us very early in production that we were going to struggle to meet that. So it meant that we could actually communicate to Square and to the wider group that based on what we wanted to achieve, we did actually have to move the date. And it wasn't a surprise. It wasn't like it came at alpha. It came fairly early in production. So even though the date was changed, there was no surprises with that, which I think is sort of the good moral of that one. So this wasn't the end of pre-production for us. That was first playable. But it really had that identity that we wanted. It was absolutely playable on the sticks as a 30-minute experience. Going into our next phase is what we call vertical slice, which is the last phase before production. This was a 7-month period where the team worked on really taking that skeleton and fleshing it out and putting the meat on the bones to make playable, full playable expressions of all the pillars. This amounted to about 1.5 to 2 hours of content at alpha quality. All the base mechanics were in and implemented. We didn't think it was going to be needed to be 2 hours. That wasn't really the aim. The aim was to make sure that we had full playable expressions of all the gameplay patterns that we needed to go on and replicate in production. So it was a case of making sure we had one of everything. And because experience was really what we were aiming for rather than components, it had to be strung together as a complete narrative start to finish. So it was contiguous. It represented every part of what we needed to build in production, and it ultimately came as a 1.5 to 2 hour experience, which was larger than I guess we planned originally. I guess the good thing from that, again, putting quality as a premium and not moving on until we actually achieved it, is when it came to doing things like demos and actually getting the word out there, we didn't have to do very much, which was a good byproduct. One, the team knew internally what they needed to build, but two, when we got asked to be on stage in 2011 from Microsoft, we said, let's take 5 minutes or so of our vertical slice and put that on stage. So literally, the work involved to do a demo for a Microsoft keynote was a small team of a few people for a few days to really just cut down the content and say, here you go. So it was not custom crafted. So that was a great byproduct of taking quality and pushing it hard early.
Another aspect of vertical slice is one of the common challenges in game development, which is sort of planning. At the same time you're putting that 1.5 hours on screen that's a demonstration of your vision, you're planning the whole game. So for us, that was it was important for us to come out of that pre-production phase knowing exactly what we were going to build. And in some ways that's a challenge just from a documenting perspective. So I think one of the ways we approached this game was to look at it as an experience-driven game, which meant it wasn't really purely a story-driven game, it wasn't purely a gameplay-driven game, it was really all of these things coming together to create an experience, because the players really don't experience them independent of each other. So this document, it's not necessarily important to see the details, but the horizontal separators are levels, so between that would represent about 20 minutes of gameplay, so each segment was about 2-minute granularity at this point. But looking at the columns, the center column was story beats. So that was much like just a treatment that you'd have for a game story. But then as you sort of expanded on that with gameplay concepts, on the right-hand column you have Lara's character arc, because obviously that was very important to us in an origin story. And then to the right of that, her gameplay progression, so where gear and abilities came in. And on the left-hand side you can see the colored bands. And the one colored band represents the different flavors of gameplay, and then the grayscale represents the intensity of that. So through this documentation process, we were able to visualize a little bit more richly than just a level document or a story document might do. And so we were able to map out and create a framework for the entire game. in our case, we were also trying to tell a fairly linear story in a fairly non-linear world. So this is just an example of then mapping that experience to our spatial layout. So we chose a hub-based system, which ultimately uses gear for the player to unlock new spaces. So down the bottom of the page here, you can see the gear that's acquired over time, and each of those is a key for one of the locked areas. So by getting new gear, you can see you can progress through the various areas of the game. So it was just tools like this that allowed us to sort of zoom out and visualize the whole game experience. But one of the great things about having that sense of a full framework, all of the disciplines can work within that. So in a lot of cases, you might have art understanding what the region is and being able to concept against the basic themes. But because we knew Lara's journey, art could do exercises like this, doing a great job of really capturing not only the physical requirements of the space, but really the emotional context of where it is in Lara's journey. So having that sense of an entire framework and coming out of pre-production with a fairly clear vision of the whole game was important to us. But as Darrell mentioned, we also had to put it on screen. So what we'll show you now is probably a 5-minute video cut together of an hour and a half of gameplay content. This was done probably at the beginning of 2011. So this is still 2 years before we shipped, but it represents the first shippable, essentially shippable content if we had to.
God's got nothing to do with it. It's good to see you two go.
Sorry, did you a real number on your leg?
No, looks worse than it is.
Something to pry this open.
So what was great about that, and it's even amazing to look back on in some ways, that was 2 years before our game shipped and before we even started production. But we had one of everything. We had an hour and a half to 2 hours in the can, and the key thing about making it a product every step of the way, this was going to ship. And it had to be treated like that. So we then had to just move on and make more. So that was the next phase of production, which was a year. So there was 12 months in production. We had about 9 hours of content to be produced in that period. We had sort of an hour and a half to 2 hours in the can from what you've just seen. And we were making them in episodes, as I mentioned earlier. So that represented one episode. Holistically, the team worked on each episode start to finish, including all the sound, the effects, the usual finishing things, and each episode, or vertical slice chunk as we called it internally, really comprised of that same sort of pre-production, production, alpha, bug fixing, sort of almost a product in itself from start to finish. I think that's the most important thing is to look at the ratio of time per episode and know that practice makes perfect. So if we said that we spent 7 months on that first chunk of an hour and a half, and then we had 12 months to do the next 9 hours, that doesn't add up on paper, as we knew internally. But what we do know is we get better with practice. And what we had to find out was how quick we could go and how much practice would make perfect. And ultimately going into production, really we did. And one of the key things to that was building expertise around each discipline and around each pillar. So we had these pillars of traversal, combat, puzzles, and some other ones outside that, such as hubs and effects, music. But ultimately the key pillars we actually built teams around that were multidisciplinary, that had their own leads, and they had their own ownership over a piece of the experience that was mapped to that larger, broader strokes in the documentation Noah was going through. And ultimately, as each team worked on a pillar, they became better and better and faster. So over the course of production, the first hour and a half to 2 hours was about 7 months. The second one was around 6 months, 5 to 6 months of that year. The third, and these are all 3-hour increments moving into production, the third one was around 3.5 months, and the last one was about 2.5 months. So by the end of production of that year, the team, along with all the external partners we had brought on to help us through production, was moving at 3 hours of content in around 2 to 3 months versus 7 months for an hour and a half of content in vertical slice. So what it allowed us to do, as I said earlier, at the end of each episodic chunk was actually make decisions and scope and really learn how much game we could produce in the time whilst maintaining quality. And ultimately production was comprised of what you just saw 4 times over. We had 250 cinematic moments and 90 minutes of custom storytelling cinematics. So it was a large cinematic pipeline that we produced in that year as well. And ultimately, we had teams around the world working for that year, producing content for the production phase. So teams in San Francisco, obviously with our sister studio in Montreal, Shanghai, India, LA, and a number of other places. But you name it, we brought them on board and said, let's get this done. So it was done in a year period, and that really brought us to alpha. Some quick docs, I'm just going to flick through them. In terms of scheduling, because we were building in patterns, right, ultimately we could actually schedule out, what are the patterns and what do we need to repeat. And each level was comprised of those patterns that we could then take from vertical slice and almost sort of map to production and say it's kind of like this, but with a different wrapper. And ultimately those patterns we could then cost against. So I'm not going to go in detail through this, but again, similar to Noah's document from a production standpoint, we added up the costs associated to each beat or each moment we produced, and we broke down each beat and moment throughout the whole game and then applied a cost to it. Ultimately, you're never right with documentation when you start out, and we refined it over time and became more and more accurate about what we could produce in the time we had. The other key thing is understanding where you're at any one period in time and having a team all understand it too. And one of the things when you've got a lot of people with their heads down producing content, just saying here's when we need to be done and being clear about it is very, very important. So we actually lined the internal team up all around the same milestones rather than have a lot of I guess, cross-hatching, if you say, in a schedule where people are finishing things at different times. We really tried to finish everybody at the same time on the end of each vertical slice chunk of content, so everybody knew when done was and what done looked like. It had to look like our first vertical slice repeated.
Yeah, and as Darrell mentioned, working with those patterns was important. So from the creative perspective, we had the Uber doc, which mapped out the whole game, but it was a higher level of detail than you would want to actually produce the content. So as we zoomed in, this represents a beat doc. So for every level we would do a beat doc for about 20 minutes of gameplay. You'd have about 10 plus pages. So the first page is something you'd find in a lot of docs, probably the setting, premise. We're tracking Lara's emotional arc as well, because that was important to us, gameplay mechanics, enemies that you'd find in the level, so a fairly standard overview. But then on the lower right-hand side of the screen, you can see sort of the first beat laid out. And it was important for us to actually, on a moment-to-moment basis, describe what the player was doing rather than just frame the high-level goals. And that was a bit of a culture shift for us as well, because in a lot of ways, developers like having a bit of a blank canvas. But the good news with putting something in place is that you know you have an answer, and that answer can always get better. So in the beats, we'd also put goals or conditions of satisfaction. So not only did we have sort of our starting point, but we understood what this beat was trying to achieve, so that as we iterated and as we improved upon it, we could make sure that we were still achieving those goals. We had to map out levels spatially, so obviously paper maps are fairly standard, but really pairing design with art as well. And Darrell talked about those cross-disciplinary teams. It's great to get in and really think about the same thing at the same time. So something on the left is an example of a key art image that would really help capture a moment of the level, but also the personality, so that as we're talking about what's going on, we can all visualize ourselves in that space. And then on the right-hand side, you see sort of our beat boards, which any moment where we had heavy character performance, scripted action, cameras, that we tended to get much better results when we took the time to sort of go through the process of doing these beat boards. Sometimes it feels, especially when you've only got 2 months left to do 3 hours of gameplay, that skipping some of these steps is an efficiency, but in the end, for us, it really wasn't. Speaking of cinematics, just a quick glimpse at our cinematic pipeline, because that was slightly different from the in-game performance moments that we did motion capture. So once we had that full Uber doc describing the game, we could write the script. So that looks like any TV or movie script. In our case, we had to extract any props, any set design elements. So in this case, we're looking at a scene that takes place in Himiko's tomb. This is the first tomb that Lara raids. We would build that out, measure it out, because when we got down to LA, this is the capture volume, there's actually a grid on the floor, and all that junk around Lara really represents elements in the 3D world, so she could be aware of that environment. You'll also notice that she has cameras mounted in front of her on her helmet. So we didn't actually capture face data, but we got frame-by-frame reference for the animators. So we were capturing the full body data, and then we were using that face information for animation reference. You can see in the background there's some monitors, so as Lara's acting out a scene, we can see something like this on the monitors. It's extremely rough. But the other great thing about this is it becomes a previs for that scene. So even out of our rehearsal shoots, we would get something like this and then could plug it into the game, and then now that story element is starting to be represented in the game experience. Once we get effects, lighting, sound, face, hands, all of the additional layers we put on, our cinematics would look something like this.
I hate tombs.
So as Darrell mentioned, we went through basically 3 versions of that production, and we really did hit our stride, but part of being able to hit our stride was sticking to those patterns, that when we visualized a new scene, we needed to see it through the lens of something we had already done.
Okay, so that brings us into our final third. We're going to run through that very, very quickly here. So we had a 12-month period where we had those 4 chunks of content in the can, and we could play it start to finish, and it was already at a very good quality level. But we knew that we wanted to edit what we had on paper and make it better once we actually saw it in the flesh, so we built time in for that. And that 12-month period was basically split 6 months into editing and 6 months into bug fixing. And ultimately, that 6-month period of editing is gold, right? I guess I would just say that without that, we would not be able to realize the game that we wanted to, because going from your idea of what a game is at 10 to 12 hours to reality, it's always going to be slightly off when you actually see it and play it through. So it gave us a chance to actually go through, play it ourselves, use usability to actually give us feedback, and essentially go through and edit that content. And then the last 6 months really were polish, and heavy play testing, heavy fixing of bugs to make it a polished gem that we wanted it to be.
And it was a great opportunity to have that time. A lot of times it's all we can do to just fix the bugs. So to have some time to actually sculpt the experience. And I would say that even though we tried to make each vertical slice as finished as possible, there's certain things that you can only sort of identify, like overall pacing and character arc, once it's all in place. So that inherently there's some improvements that can be made on any game at this phase if you leave yourself the time. But we wanted to, I guess, make the best use of that time. So here's just another quick document. And this should look familiar because it's very similar to the Uber document, but whereas the first document we looked at represented our intent, this is actually our actuals. So every square is a minute of gameplay, and again, it's color-coded by the type of gameplay and the experience. This was valuable because games are fairly intangible, and the script doesn't really represent the game. So when you're sitting there and you're talking about how do we sculpt this experience, it's really nice to have something, a tangible representation of that experience. So this is zoomed way out. You can see that's our 10-hour experience, or our 10-hour core experience, laid left to right with all of the, I guess, progression along the bottom there. Now, that was just basically assessing where we were at, but in terms of informing iteration, we really relied heavily on playtesting throughout this whole process. So qualitatively asking questions about, do you enjoy this? Is this too difficult? Or in this case, story comprehension. So we'd have multiple people come in, play through the entire game, ask them questions at various points. And in this case, we identified some issues. The lower comprehension in the beginning is fine because Lara's thrust into a crazy situation and she doesn't even know what's going on. But that dip at the end was a problem, that we didn't want people to not understand what was going on at the end of the story. So ultimately we did a lot of rewrites at the outset of our post-production process, but then we would validate those changes. So a subsequent play test gave us this graph, and we're like, excellent. We definitely made some improvements, and there's still a couple points that we could then identify and say, all right, now let's go address that. And so the idea of informing your refinements through playtesting and validating your changes through playtesting was essential. And just one other component with that process, which is, in addition to asking them questions, we were also capturing data over the network. So regardless of what they said about a level, we could see things like how much damage they were taking in a space or how many deaths, and that really helped us with the tuning and balancing aspect of it. So I guess the key is leave yourself that time to iterate and make your game really what it wants to be in the end.
So finally, just wrapping up, I guess this is great to give you a broad view. There's some more detailed talks, as I said, around Tomb Raider today, so please go see those. I want to leave you with some pro tips, but one of which is that it really is a team effort, and Noah and I get to represent the team up here, but ultimately it was a team that made this happen, and the team really had the drive and passion to go through all the different challenges you get in development to produce the game we produced. So it is not as effortless as what you see in this PowerPoint, as I'm sure you all know. But the pro tips really to leave you with, really that know as you go. I'm going to show you one last video just after this to wrap up. But knowing at every step of the way what game you are making and whether it's good or not, whether you're hitting your goals, your quality bar, was critical, and has been critical for the last couple of projects at Crystal in the way that we produced them. So being great at every step is critical. Knowing that you're great at every step, knowing you're getting what you want, and not waiting till alpha to find out and find find out you haven't got enough time to make it great. The cross-discipline teams around pillars was a key change that we made in terms of how we produce the content, fitting into a larger macro map of the narrative and gameplay experience. And with this ownership and this expertise, it really gave us the quality but also the speed to produce content that we need to in that production phase. Lastly, we went through the post-production phase, but you can't shortchange that. You're never going to get the game you want when you see it at alpha, so build time in to get the game you want post-alpha. Don't just bug fix and put it out the door. So that's really a key tip for us. And ultimately that bug fixing and play testing all the way through to the end, I mean, it really is what makes a polished, refined experience, so don't shortchange that as well. Lastly, I'll just leave you with a short video, which is really the culmination of all the work, which is a trailer we put out just before Christmas. But I think the key thing to look at with that know-as-you-go mentality is at the end, it's very close to what we had 3 years ago. And I hope you can see that through this talk and through the production of this game, that every step of the way, it really wasn't too far off. You could squint a little bit at the beginning in the first playable, but from then on, it was the real deal. And ultimately, that really allowed us to scope and manage our project as we went. It wasn't on rails, but it gave us the feedback and the input we needed to make the right choices in order to hit our dates and our quality. So I'll leave you with that and say thank you for joining us. And
I don't know if we have time for full audience questions, but Darrell and I will hang out. So if anybody has questions
we'll
about the process or Crystal or anything.
So much has happened. Our captain is injured.
Have you heard from any of the others?
Nothing.
Our crew is scattered. I have a bad feeling about this. I've got to find them. We're hunted by the island's inhabitants.
They've got me locked up.
Sam, listen. I'm gonna get you out of there.
After all, you're a Croft.
I don't think I'm that kind of Croft.
Sure you are. You just don't know it yet.
All right, let's do this.
Sometimes you've got to make sacrifices, Laura. You can't save everyone.
There's no other choice. I've got to do this. If I don't survive, none of us will.
All right, thank you. Please start.